Hey everyone, welcome to hashtag Malkin Live. I want to say hello and thank you to all of the viewers out there on YouTube, on Twitter and Periscope, and on Facebook. So I'm going to just vamp a couple of seconds here and let people on Facebook trickle in. I know it takes a little while for the notice to go out there. I'm so excited. We have a fantastic repeat guest. My friend Darren J. Beattie is going to join us in just a couple of seconds. I want to give you a couple of heads up though on things that are on my radar screen, and actually they directly relate to what I'm going to be talking about with Darren. So many of you have been bombarding me in comments and emails. When are you going to have Darren on to talk about color revolution? Well, he's a busy guy. He's got tons of stuff going on and lots more information to deliver to you at Revolver News, which, by the way, I know you all saw it. Got a shout out from President Trump and, of course, Darren's epic appearance on Fox News, Tucker Carlson, which is really just taken off. I mean, it's amazing to be able to break through the mainstream media monopoly and to plant an idea that so many people are opposed to even having been named. It's just an incredible accomplishment. Related to that is my column today, which you can find at uns.com, on the Sunrise Movement. This is essentially a front group for Sierra Club. They're using climate change and the environment as their umbrella, as their disguise to mobilize what they explicitly call mass civil disobedience. And this is the group that was out there immediately over the weekend at Lindsey Graham's house following the passing of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. They are targeting other Supreme Court nominees who are on the short list, as well as other Republican politicians. So I go into a little bit of their funding and the fact that they have 400 plus hubs across the country where they are training young people from ages 18 to 25. A lot of the money for their group came from Sierra Club, which of course has as its biggest funders George Soros, Michael Bloomberg, the Rockefeller Foundation, the Wallace Global Fund, etc. And I'll bring up a photo of some of these people and compare it to some of the other agitators who've been funded for the last 30 years in this country. It's actually an interesting visual. Anyway, okay, that's enough vamping. Hello, everybody. Glad you're joining me. And I'm going to bring in right now, without further ado, Darren J. Beattie. Hey, I have to ask you something. I don't know if it's too personal. What does the J in Darren J. Beattie stand for?
Jeffrey.
Darren Jeffrey Beattie. Now you all know. You see, that's your entertainment tonight. Fun fact about Darren J. Beattie for the day. Whoa, what a week or two you had.
Indeed. Yes. It's been wild.
So what's it been like in the wake of the Tucker Carlson segment for Revolver News?
Well, it's been fantastic. Obviously, an appearance like that drives a lot of traffic, and we'd been, doing very well with traffic anyway. So it was just an additional boost. And I think the best part about that segment was that it really drew attention to this particular plot, this color revolution plot. It laid the case out, I think, very plainly before many millions of people. I believe 5 million were watching that evening, which is incredible. And the segment is getting a lot of play online, which will probably amount to an additional million at least. And as you're suggesting, it's a remarkable thing to be able to call out these figures who are so used to operating in the shadows with absolute impunity. There's nobody on this beat. Like Revolver.news started this beat really, as far as this election season at least, to present the idea to the American public that what's happening is not just a coup in some vague or general sense, that, as I mentioned on Tucker's show and elsewhere, it's a very specific type of coup, a color revolution regime change model. And I'd lay out in the Revolver.news pieces, there are 3 of them, lay out the striking similarities in terms of strategies and tactics used principally this combination of in a contested election scenario and massive mobilized civil disobedience, massive protests, which as a term of art, they call peaceful protests.
Right.
All the color revolutions you see, they use peaceful protests as a term of art. It's a craft term used by color revolution professionals. So it's important to understand there's a very specific context for this vocabulary that could otherwise, seem like something very benign or even desirable. Similarly, the term democracy itself for these groups is a term of art. It's very funny because it means the precise opposite of what we would think democracy means. We would think democracy could mean if there are energies in the population associated with, say, the election of Donald Trump, with Brexit, with other kind of populist victories that are achieved through the ballot box. Normally, we kind of naive citizens would think that that's a very healthy demonstration of democracy. And in fact, as I pointed out, in the case of Trump specifically, even if you don't like him, you have to acknowledge he ran against the coordinated opposition of every single powerful institution in the country. And he won with the support of the people. If that's not like a stress test for democracy, I don't know what is. And it's precisely the democratic legitimacy of Trump's victory, the democratic legitimacy of Brexit, the popular support for populist movements across the Western world now that has got these people so terrified. And they use this word, they use the term populism. They use that derisively to refer to the people getting what they want through legitimate democratic channels. When they say democracy, they mean people like Norm Eisen, whom I called out on Tucker. Democracy means Norm Eisen's foot on your neck. That's what democracy means, really. When they talk about democracy, they mean this specific color revolution network, which unfortunately is deeply entrenched within our own national security apparatus. This is not like a Democrat-Republican thing. It's deeply entrenched in the national security apparatus, State Department. There's an entire constellation of NGOs, and it's a network. They have a specific playbook. They've run it for decades against regimes in Eastern Europe that they don't like, and they're running the same exact playbook against Trump. So
exactly.
So it's the same playbook and the same people. And I think part of what was so powerful about the Tucker segment is that I think sometimes people on the right are abstract to a fault. It's, of course, important to present a compelling theoretical case for what's going on, but it's orders of magnitude more powerful, more effective to attach a name and a face to a problem.
Yes. Speaking of which, and I'm just going to intervene there just a second, because there's a name and a face that you engaged with and called out on Twitter. And I want people to see this and have you respond to it. This is a woman named Nina Jankowicz, and she's one of many who've been triggered by the 3-piece series that is on Revolver News, and we'll touch on all 3 of them you've alluded to. The Curious Case of George Kent, Norm Eisen, and the Transition Integrity Project. But let's just take a look at this. Let's see.
First of all, color revolutions have nothing to do with race. The term was coined in the early 2000s when countries like the Republic of Georgia and Ukraine had spontaneous, peaceful, democratic revolutions that had colorful nicknames. In 2003, the Georgian opposition protested the opening of a new session of parliament based on fraudulent election results. They did it while carrying roses, hence the Rose Revolution. In 2004 and 2005, Ukrainians protested their own rigged election. Candidate Viktor Yushchenko's campaign branding was orange, hence the Orange Revolution. You get the idea. Color revolutions have earned a bad rap, though, mostly thanks to Vladimir Putin, because they brought in democratically minded governments that threatened Russian influence in the region. Putin likes to suggest they are CIA organized. That is not true. Believe it or not, sometimes people get fed up with having their voices silenced for decades. Putin's narratives intentionally rob protesters of agency. They discount the grievances that brought them to the streets, risking their lives, and ultimately they undermine the resulting governments. And now we're seeing the same narrative cropping up here in the United States. Here's why it doesn't fit. First of all, in case we've forgotten, protest is a democratic right. You are entitled to it, no matter your opinion. Second of all, color revolutions happen in autocracies, when people are fed up with the indignities of an entrenched regime. While we have witnessed some democratic backsliding here in the United States, we are not an autocracy. We still have checks and balances. We still enjoy democratic rights. Certainly, we are not Georgia in 2003, Ukraine in 2004, or Belarus today. Finally, and perhaps most importantly, these events usually happen in response to a rigged election. Even today, we should still have the confidence that our votes will be counted fairly and accurately. I do. And as a reminder, there's only one candidate who is tweeting about rigged election results. So, in short, color revolutions aren't dirty. They're expressions of democratic will, and they should inspire us all. P.S. Make sure you're registered to vote and make a voting plan today. First of all, color revolution.
Shut up. Okay.
No, I mean, like well, the thing is, when I mentioned it, I don't like to be, mean for its own sake. And there are a lot of, people who have come out who are very triggered by it. Color Revolution people in the network, people like McFowle, people like Ambassador Freed, people like Carpenter. And, the very satisfying thing is that the person that I attacked on Tucker, Norm Eisen, is very much the ringleader in this. You can tell that he is because he has all of the minions running interference operations for him. He's been, he's usually very active on Twitter. Now he's kind of quiet like a church mouse plotting his next move, but he's someone who's definitely not used to being called out. But in the case of Nina, I almost feel like it's mean because she's just reading the script given to her. I almost feel like when I listen to her, it's like when you're in an airplane and you're about to take off and they give you that pre-takeoff thing, there's just some nice lady who reads the script and she maybe understands it, maybe not. I mean, she's probably doing well. I think her family's probably very proud of her and they think she's doing important things because she's reading the script. She read it well. She didn't trip up. And so, I'm kind of proud of her actually for doing a good job in that respect. But of course, the content of what she's saying is totally absurd and just fits completely into what I'm saying is that they use words in the exact opposite to the meaning that any normal person would interpret it. When they say they're defending democracy, what they mean is they're defending the power interests of this particular segment of the ruling class that absolutely hates Trump, that absolutely hates Brexit, that absolutely hates anything associated with the energies, the populist energies that have completely transformed the political landscape since 2015. They view those developments as, in particular, the Brexit, which, I'm not even a huge Brexit person, but it did terrify them. Brexit and Trump were the political twin towers for them. There was a political 9/11, and these very same Atlanticist groups, the Atlantic Council, various operations, the State Department, there's a whole constellation of NGOs, and they viewed this as a threat in just the same way that they view Eastern European countries they don't like as a threat. They've been running the same playbook. And it's actually interesting. The color revolution explanation has such explanatory power for things that would otherwise seem very curious. And I'll just state two of those things for now. One of them is, you might have noticed that so many of the key figures involved in the removal of Trump, or the attempted removal of Trump, particularly in the impeachment proceedings, so many of these figures have or have had bureaucratic posts related to Eastern Europe. Seems like a very odd coincidence. Why are all of these people, why is this whole network of people who are so actuated against Trump, who use this specific vocabulary of invoking democracy, quote unquote, to attack anything that the people actually support? Why are all these people professionally involved with Eastern Europe in either a bureaucratic context or an NGO context? The color revolution models explains it very well. It's the same regime change color revolution professionals running the same playbook. Also, it explains why Russia has featured so prominently in the color revolution attempt to remove Trump. It's actually, it's almost laughable because it's such a paint by numbers thing for these people. It's like the color revolution model is all they know. And because they're usually going after Eastern European countries, their go-to mode of attack is to associate them with Putin because they're in Eastern Europe.
Right.
And just because they happen to have that vocabulary and that model on hand, they very kind of, in a almost like remarkably clumsy way, copy and paste that onto their attack, their color revolution attack against Trump, when otherwise it would make very little sense. Like if you were trying to attack Trump for, his being beholden to some other country, I can think of about 10 that would make more sense before Russia. So it just doesn't make sense from a political standpoint. It makes all the sense in the world once you understand that it's the same people running the same playbook, the same color revolution professionals. And it's just amazing that thing from Nina. And again, I don't want to attack her because I think, she's doing a good job. She read the script. She didn't trip up. She didn't stutter or anything.
She's the stewardess telling you that the oxygen tank.
No, it's amazing. She did a very good job. And in a way, I'm proud of her. But she did a great job there reading the script. But again, the content of the script is ridiculous. She's talking about, these people want to silence, all these authoritarians want to silence. That may or may not be true. In fact, in order to accept the thesis that I'm presenting, you could be perfectly okay with the US government running color revolutions against Eastern European countries. That's a totally separate question. Mm-hmm. It's not material to the case that I'm making. You could like what they're doing in Eastern Europe, or you cannot like it. My point is simply that they're running the same model here domestically against the democratically elected President Donald Trump, and that is wrong, and that should be exposed. And so it's not really an issue of defending or not whatever is going on in Eastern Europe, but it is interesting that Nina invokes these authoritarians who silence their people, when in fact the same color revolution network, I'll get into this much more in the coming weeks, has been instrumental in the censorship of the internet since 2015. They have all kinds of associated organizations that play a very active role in censoring the American people. And again, they use another term of art to do this. Peaceful protests, a term of art. It's a term of craft. It doesn't mean what we think it should mean. Peaceful protest means major cities in the country burning down. They say it's organic. It's a demonstration of organic protest. It's not organic. It's highly organized, highly well-funded, as you've been pointing out in some of your work. There's nothing organic about these protests. So it's not organic. It's highly organized. It's not peaceful, even though they call it peaceful. It has nothing to do with supporting democracy. In fact, if you look at what these organizations are doing, it's the least democratic thing you can possibly imagine, because they're doing everything in their power to make sure that the election is decided in the streets with the quote unquote peaceful protesters that they've organized, and in the courts, and not in the polls. They want the election to be decided anywhere but the polls, because the polls are the one place they don't control, because the people don't like what they're forcing down our throats.
Yes.
Again, like, democracy for them is Norm Eisen's foot stepping on your throat. That's what they mean by democracy. Democracy, according to them, is globalism, it's open borders, it's horrible trade deals, it's a corrupt, rotten elite will do anything imaginable just so long as it doesn't benefit the general interest of American citizens. That's what they mean by democracy. That's what they mean. That's what they're attempting to protect. And so they want this election to be adjudicated anywhere but the polls. And that's what they call democracy. They want it on the streets. They want it in the courts, anywhere but the polls. Because ever since 2016, they freaked out. They said, oh my God, our grasp on power is being threatened. And ever since then, all these stakeholders, not just the color revolution people, although they are an important faction, every single stakeholder was threatened by Trump's victory, and there were many, basically agreed that the American people will never be able to meddle in their own elections again. And that's what they call defending democracy. Of course, it's a joke. It's a scam. It would be laughable if it weren't so serious. And I really hope that every person read these articles in Revolver News, share them with everyone you know. It's the most important thing going on, other than perhaps the COVID lockdowns, which we've discussed before. I think the COVID lockdowns are the greatest crime against humanity, other than war and genocide. But other than that, it is the most important thing going on. And I think your readers and everyone they know, the general American public, you owe it to yourself. You owe it to everyone you know. Go to revolver.news and specifically read these 3 installments. There are going to be many more. Many, many more names will be called out. And get a sense of what's playing out before your eyes. They're trying to steal the election. They're running a color revolution model.
If I had to pick the 2 colors of the revolution that's happening in this country, I would pick yellow and black. And I just want to show people, this is the group that is now agitating on the lawns of people like Lindsey Graham and Mitch McConnell. It's a group called Sunrise Movement. And you can see the yellow and black logo here. It's like they all have the same designer. Right. And, you know, pattern recognition is very valuable. And this is the same, you know, this is the same color schemes of the Answer Coalition. This is the J20 riots on Inauguration Day.
I've heard that pattern recognition is racist. Be careful.
Yes, I know. It's a blessing and a curse, is it not, Darren? Here's they're behind the shutdown ICE riots, which have racked this country for the last 4 years. Nice yellow and black there. And, you know, it goes back to the mid 2000s during the Bush years as well. So that's our yellow and black
it's incredible.
Revolution here.
Just one more thing, if I can interject about that Nina clip that I found amusing. I found it it's just such a commentary on how absurd our country is right now, how absurd the discourse, how absurd it is that someone like Nina is even like kind of trotted out to the public as an expert on anything.
Yeah,
you know, again, I said I wanted to be nice, but it's very clear she's never had an original thought in her entire life, and she never will. But I think it's really interesting that, like, the first thing that she thought she needed to tell the audience is the color revolution has nothing to do with race. It has nothing to do with colors. As though, like, her number one concern was that people might think, oh my God, is the color revolution racist? No, we're just using the color revolution to overturn a democratically elected president. It's just, one of the greatest, crimes going on against the American people. But I want to assure you, it's not racist. It's a color. Before you know it, they're going to change it to people of color revolution.
Right, revolution of color.
Right,
would be
revolution
the proper
of
term.
color.
Yes.
But it just shows you, like, the mindset is so juvenile. It's so childlike, and I don't know, how is our country going to make it in a serious way in the 21st century when this is the kind of the hierarchy of taboos, as they call it, that governs our way of speaking and thinking. I think it's just an interesting thought exercise, independent of the color revolution question. It's like, who would suffer a greater reputational cost? Someone who is a child rapist but professes fealty to equality, or someone who cured cancer but was revealed to have used the N-word 15 years ago. And not that either, I'm not endorsing using of any bad language, but just the thought experiment itself is very instructive to understand how fundamentally unserious our country is at this moment. And if we're thinking about having a real country, having a serious country, having a competitive country globally with China and everything, we need to get serious. We can't be this clown nation that is incessantly wrapped up in dumb discussions about what is racist and what isn't. We need to get on with the business of building and continuing a civilization. And unless we're able to do that and get rid of this perverse moral framework, this twisted and inverted moral framework, I think the country is not going to be kind of in the right shape going forward. And you just see it everywhere. You see it represented everywhere. Even Jeffrey Dahmer, the famous serial killer and cannibal, in an interview, they asked him, because some of the victims he selected were African American. They asked him, "Are you a racist?" And he said, "No, I'm not a racist." He defended. He said, "I may be a serial killer, I may be a cannibal, but I'm not
I'm not a racist."
And that's the attitude, and it's just so dumb and it's so unserious. And we really need to get over it now.
I hate Black people, but I don't hate them.
Right, exactly. No, it's remarkable. I'm not making that up. That's a real thing.
Okay, so the opening salvo for the series on the color revolution in America was published August 18th. And this one specifically looked at George Kent, his role as a Never Trump impeachment witness, and then connected it to the work that he did in Belarus. And his actual title is Deputy Assistant Secretary of the Bureau of European and Eurasian Affairs at the State Department. And from what I understand, you've said that he is still there. He is still employed at the State Department.
Yep, he is. And I have it on very good authority that Secretary of Pompeo read the piece, read this revolver piece. And so far, no action has been taken, unfortunately. I hope that changes. Again, this is just a really, I'm really glad that this is the first installment in the series, because again, it makes an important point, but it uses a specific person to make that point. Now, George Kent is nowhere near as important in the hierarchy as Norm Eisen, the subject of the third installment, but he's a good figure to illustrate the thesis. And so George Kent, for those, and I hope everyone goes to revolver.news, read the whole thing, but just as a quick summary, George Kent is a State Department official. He was a star witness against the president in the impeachment proceedings. He's a star witness along with his former boss, Yovanovitch, and along with Lieutenant Colonel Vindman, whom I imagine many of us remember. Again, all of these people held key diplomatic security state posts related to Eastern Europe. Again, that's the pattern starting to emerge. Now, unlike Lieutenant Colonel Vindman and unlike Yovanovitch, who at least were fired as a result of their testimony against the president in the impeachment proceedings, which would make sense. If you testify against your boss in an impeachment proceeding, it would seem reasonable that you wouldn't be able to hold your job. But again, the laws of reason are quite often suspended in this clown world that we inhabit. And so in the case of George Kent, not only was he not fired for testifying against the president, he was in fact promoted within the State Department. And so that would be enough of a story. Like if that were just the story, it would be, oh, this is interesting and this is kind of a scandal, and it fits into the broader narrative of personnel issues, which is, President Trump's great, the agenda is great, but you need to promote people who are on board with the agenda if you want to get it done. And this is an example of how that's not happening. And in this case, the guy wasn't even not fired, he was actually promoted. So that would be story enough, but it gets way more interesting, and this is how the original thesis developed. It's like, okay, he was promoted, but what is he doing? What is his job? Just, out of curiosity. Well, it turns out that he is the head of, Eurasian Europe affairs, and specifically, he's in charge of Belarus. Now, isn't that interesting? Again, another example of how it's all of these color revolution professionals perform color revolution overseas are the same people using the same playbook against Trump. So in his case, he's presiding over Belarus. And for those who don't know, again, this is not to defend or not to defend whatever's going on in Belarus. It's simply to notice the pattern. And it's very similar because you have a target leader, target regime that the Color Revolution Network doesn't like. And what they do is they run an operation that involves contested election scenario and massive protests, which the same constellation of NGOs have used the term of art, peaceful
protest. There it is in the article. I just scrolled down to it. This is Euronews, just some generic blue checkmark account. And there's the women lined up on the streets. That's what they do. They're mass civil disobedience theater, peaceful protest. Karen.
Where have I seen this movie before?
Yes, right.
It's peaceful protest. It's the same playbook. And isn't it curious that the State Department official who nominally running all this is the same guy who was one of the star impeachment witnesses against Trump? But it gets even better because when you look at his professional history, his former boss was Yovanovitch, the fired woman who's testified. And guess what he was doing? He was hanging out in Ukraine in some deputy political position. He was hanging out in Ukraine, coincidentally, during the Orange Revolution, the most famous of all the color revolutions. Isn't that a remarkable coincidence?
Yes.
And by the way, there were several sources who talked to Revolver News for this piece in the State Department and out, deeply familiar with the workings of this and the color revolution professionals, who cited George Kent as, quote unquote, a color revolution expert. So this is very much in his field. He's very much in the network. You can do network tracing to find that the same constellation of NGOs, they're all together. And in fact, Norm Eisen, the subject of the third and probably most powerful installment that became the subject of the Tucker segment, Norm Eisen makes a little, he's constantly tweeting stuff about Belarus. He stopped tweeting a little bit after the segment, but he's come out. His first tweet since the segment was to celebrate protests in Belarus, remarkably enough. Right. And he's in charge of many groups. He has many, many hats, so to speak. He is really one of the key figures. But one of the groups that he runs is called the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group. Again, isn't it funny how all of these groups that do everything they can to prevent the people from having a say in their own lives, they all use the term democracy.
Democracy, yes.
Wherever you see the term democracy or disinformation, you're dealing with this color revolution professional network of, State Department, national security types, very nasty people. They hate the American public. They hate the expression of populism. Their only role when they say democracy, their only role is to preserve their foot on your neck and make sure that the people's revolt that began with the election of Trump is sucked of oxygen and never has a chance to fulfill its objective of really outmaneuvering the corrupt ruling class that has been responsible for so much damage in our country. They're instruments of this corrupt ruling class, and in all of their efforts, by hook or by crook, to support the interests of this corrupt ruling class, they dare to call it democracy, which is a joke, but it's also kind of disgusting. But in this group called the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group, which has a Twitter account, several people in the Twitter comments remarked on, all of this peaceful protest, it's like they're anti-Trump people. So they're like, oh, we need this here. And the official Twitter account of the Transatlantic Democracy Working Group responded, we may be witnessing the ghost of democracy's future.
Oh,
so
geez.
Explicit, and that tweet is in the it's in I think at least 2 of the Revolver.News installments, and that group is a group run by none other than Norm Eisen, the chief legal hatchet man, and a man whose career runs through every single facet of the color revolution against Trump. So it's really remarkable. It's like it's very satisfying to call these people out, but it's satisfying on a moral level because what they're doing is evil. But it's also satisfying on an intellectual level because it's really as though you kind of cracking a puzzle here. And once you crack the puzzle, like it all fits into place. Everything that's going on fits into place, and there's deep explanatory power for what's going on. And now it's simply a matter of presenting it to the public. And like I said, there's going to be much more. Revolver is going to be on this through the election and probably afterward. So there's even bigger stuff to come. But I think what's been presented are the building blocks of this thesis, and everybody needs to look at it. If you want to understand what's happening to your country, you need to read these pieces at Revolver.News.
So let's touch on the third one. We've got about 20 minutes left. The Transition Integrity Project.
That's the second one.
What's that?
That's the second one.
Oh, the second one. Right. It was George Kent, then Transition Integrity Project, then the Norm Eisen piece. So this is the second of the trio. I think this is the one that has the most right now too mainstream penetration, because people are worried about ballot fraud.
Right.
And so who is helming the Transition Integrity Project?
Right. So this is an interesting organization, and the head of it is someone called Rosa Brooks, who you can't make this up. This woman is the former assistant to George Soros at the Open Society Foundation. It's so amazing. Like what they do is like they have someone run a psychological operation to seed this idea of a contested election and election fraud. They pick someone who has very, very close professional ties to George Soros, and then they say anybody who brings up the name George Soros as being some ridiculous conspiracy type. It's really crazy. Like it's not my fault that they picked literally the worst person they could. At least pick someone who's like not publicly associated with Soros, but they just do this to taunt us. It's like, okay, we're gonna pick George Soros's former personal assistant, but don't talk about George Soros because that's just it's ridiculous. So she's the head of it, and the short version is that they're running these so-called war games on what's going to happen in election day. And again, it's another example they accuse the other side of doing what they're doing. And it's so true. They have such contempt for the English language. They have such contempt for the meaning of words because they use it in the precise opposite manner that any ordinary person would understand it. And so in these war games, and they call these war games bipartisan, but it's really all of the color revolution types on the left, Democratic operatives, plus the never Trump kind of national security system. So they call it bipartisan, but it's really like everyone's part of the same club, and the club is doing everything they can to destroy Trump. So it's not, and it actually, in one way you could say, oh, it's not bipartisan because they both hate Trump. And in a way it actually is. And it underscores a more important fact that the hatred toward Trump actually is bipartisan, because Trump represented a threat to the power structure, which is bipartisan, which transcends partisanship.
Yes.
And, military industrial complex, national security apparatus, and so forth. And so they have this bipartisan war game, which, sounds far more sophisticated than it is. It's really just a kind of, Dungeons and Dragons type of like role playing that they're doing.
They're LARPing.
A glorified Dungeons and Dragons session with, discredited, washed up, never Trumpers. And so they did this, and amazingly, in the war game, they found that, the only scenario in which the nation didn't erupt in violence was a landslide for Biden. Funny how that works. We looked at the data. And the data showed us that the only scenario in which the nation doesn't erupt in violence is a Joe Biden landslide, which sounds absurd if you don't interpret it as a threat. And when you interpret it as a threat, it becomes something more malicious. But either way, that was their conclusion. Their war game for the other scenario was, if Trump, if it's not a landslide for Biden, Trump will not concede the election, and there will be a contested scenario. And they float all of these crazy ideas. We need massive demonstrations. It's electoral fraud and so forth. And it's part of this idea. They're memeing this idea into people's heads that there will be a contested election, that Trump won't concede. And if he doesn't concede, it's an act of authoritarianism that will justify extra democratic measures to remove him, either in the courts or, most disturbingly, through the military. And Revolver ran another piece that's very, very scary about how key Democrat operatives and officials in the national security state, including Mattis, are all kind of floating this idea that there might be a military removal of Trump if he refuses to leave office in the case that Biden wins, or it's a contested scenario. Joe Biden entertained this idea. Al Gore entertained this idea. Rosa Brooks, in fact, the convener of this fake war game thing, which is really just a psyop to condition people, one, to the fact that we're going to have a contested election. Therefore, the election is going to go to the courts, conveniently enough, which they control. Remember, they want going to do everything they can to push the election to the streets, to the courts, because they can't win it in the ballot box. This information operation is part of that. They're saying, we're going to do this massive mail-in program that's just guaranteed to cause problems and guaranteed to follow up with court battles. They're putting it in the court because it's safer for them than to adjudicate in the ballots. And so they're memeing this idea that there's going to be a contested scenario. Trump, justifiably, it won't leave office until it's clear what's going on, but they're trying to formulate this scenario in advance as Trump being an authoritarian, not leaving office when he's required to. And Joe Biden, Al Gore, Rosa Brooks, and a bunch of other people are now seeding the idea that there might be a military removal that's required, which is deeply dangerous stuff. AG Barr has called it playing with fire, and I agree. It's even to talk about it is a very dangerous thing because it's totally ridiculous. And it's even more ridiculous when you think that Hillary Clinton explicitly said that Joe Biden should concede under no circumstances. So they've created a situation where it's bound to be chaos unless there's a landslide for either side, which frankly I don't anticipate. So unless there's a landslide for either side, there's going to be contested election chaos, which is going to go to the courts. The color revolution playbook is to fight the lawfare battle. Norm Eisen is the top guy for this. He's got the lawfare on, in coordination with these massive acts of peaceful protests, flooding the nation's capital. The coordination of massive protests and contested election scenario, that's the color revolution, and that's what they're running. And they're suggesting that Joe Biden should concede under no circumstances. And effectively, if Trump doesn't concede on day one, their extra democratic color revolution measures are thereby justified.
Right.
So
Right.
they're setting up all the pieces for this steal that they're planning through the absolute contempt that they have for language. They call burning down major cities peaceful protests. They call overturning democratically elected president, they call that democracy. They call censoring any information that doesn't fit their carefully manicured narrative, they call that disinformation. Every word they use is a term of art, and it means the precise opposite of what any ordinary person would think it's meaning.
And to that point, there's the Michael McFaul tweet that's embedded in the piece on the Transition Integrity Project. Right. Autocrats have demonized the phrase color revolutions. I use the term democratic breakthrough.
Yeah, democratic breakthrough is a Black Lives Matter protester smashing through a window.
Yeah, that's right. Or through somebody's head.
Right. No, it's really amazing. It's absolute contempt for language, but they're able to get away with it because they do have sophisticated network. And again, I think the lesson for us, we need to do everything to stop it now. I think the best thing we can do is just education. We need to get this word out there. Please, everyone, go revolver.news, sign up for the newsletter, read these pieces and share them and talk about them with everyone. That's what we can do now. But going forward, we really need to take some lessons, some hard lessons as to the kind of organizational sophistication that's been achieved by these networks. The right, in many ways it's good, but the right it's like so far behind in terms of its organizational sophistication, in terms of its resource allocation, understanding what matters, making high leverage plays. These guys are really sophisticated. They're really well funded. And part of what I'm trying to do, but I think others should as well, is really understand these organizations, how they're structured, how they operate, with a view toward not only stopping them, but emulating what works. And and there's just a heartbreaking lack of organizational sophistication on the right. It seems like very few people are playing for keeps at all. People on the right are playing for lobbying contracts. They're playing for Fox News hits.
Contracts, yes.
They're playing for every kind of, dumb, there's just a lack of ambition. It's like if you play for keeps, you operate in a certain way. And to their credit, people on the other side play for keeps. So I have tremendous admiration for George Soros. The guy is, practically he's in his 90s or late 80s, and he spends every waking moment figuring out how to advance his vision of the world by any means necessary. He's not out there playing golf. He's not, watching reruns on TV, and he's in his late 80s. And who do we have on the right that even comes remotely close to someone of that kind of intelligence, sophistication, and resources? Nobody. And that's our fault. That's not George Soros's fault. That's our fault. So I actually admire George. I'd love to sit down and talk with him. He's someone I admire because he's a serious person, and he's someone who's playing for keeps. He's not, whereas these other people, like, no offense to her, but Nina, come on, Nina did a good job. And I want to reiterate, I'm proud of her because she didn't stutter. She made it through the whole script. So good job, Nina. I think you made everybody proud. Okay. But we need to have serious people.
A couple of questions from our commenters on Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter. We've got several thousand people who've hung on for the entire broadcast. And really, people just want to know. I mean, you addressed it. You said just getting educated and sharing all of the articles and getting the information out there. But people really want to know what they can do to counter the revolutionaries that are on the streets, and what is the right going to do about the court battle?
Well, the court battle is really important, and there are several dimensions to it. So, like, it's, and this, as far as the general public, I guess, you can put pressure on your state governments to, depending on what state you're in, figure out what the state rules are, for instance, for faithless electors, because one of Norm Eisen's tactics, he tried it actually in the aftermath of 2016, he was unsuccessful, is to get faithless electors simply to vote for the Democrat, even when the state decided otherwise. So figure out, what state you're in, especially if you're in a swing state, figure out what the state elector policy is and put tremendous pressure on your state government to make sure that, the people like Norm Eisen are not able to use, various machinations to, get the electors to go on the other side. Electoral integrity. Again, it's like the Transition Integrity Project. It sounds good. There should be integrity, but again, it's one of those things. It means the exact opposite of what it should mean. And it leads us to think, like, transition into what? Transition from a free society into something resembling a dystopia is more what it looks like. But there should be integrity to the process, and people need to get involved in the election day. If there's any kind of supervisory role going on that you can have, put pressure on the local governments to make sure that all the polling stations are secure. I think it would have to be done on a federal level, but there needs to be some kind of chain of custody due diligence related to all of the mail-in ballots. Like, this is all of this stuff needs to be done really by the Republican Party, by Trump, and at the federal level. But on the state level, look at the faithless elector issue and make sure that the state government is doing everything conceivable to ensure that there's no funny business going on with the mail-in ballots. That's what I would say. Other than the educational aspect, those are the things that I would emphasize in terms of what the citizens can do to help prevent this.
Just a side note that there's a great organization called True the Vote that you can volunteer for. They do this type of thing of being election day watchdogs. They train people, and I'm sure they're going to be hands-on with regard to all of the efforts to stave off any kind of mail-in fraud and ballot fraud. What's the name of the woman who leads that organization? Catherine Engelbrecht. So go to truethevote2020.org for that. And then in terms of, I mentioned the streets, and this has been, it's sort of been an ongoing debate, not entirely in public, but about the extent to which ordinary citizens should be out there countering these agitators. I don't recommend it if you are not fully trained, for one thing. But groups like Sunrise Movement, I mean, they are, at least optically, they're supposed to be the most peaceful of the peaceful protests, but they're really just serving as a shield for the more violent elements. There's nothing on the right, at least that has any kind of mainstream imprimatur. I mean, it's been left to the 3%ers and Patriot Prayer and the Proud Boys and such. Have you weighed in on that?
Kind of. Like my position is that because massive demonstrations are part of the color revolution playbook, I don't think it's wise for the president to cede that physical territory to his enemies. And I think that it's something that would probably, preferably it would come at the direction of the president or at the encouragement of the president to make sure that his constituencies, it's not just these, kind of a lot of the labor union organized, all of these people protesting on the left, it's all organized, it's not organic, it's all kind of deeply, it's very, artificial, controlled. There's a mechanism in place, there's a machine in place that they run. And those people are going to be flooding DC. And I think it would be preferable to have Trump's constituencies make their physical presence known in DC for various reasons. But one of the reasons is part of the color revolution psychological operation is they, astroturf all of these, organized protesters. They flood them into a place. And then they engineer a situation where the authorities have to clamp down on them. And so they represent it as the evil authoritarians clamping down on the people. When in fact, this is the opposite of the case. The people support Trump. The people don't support these nut jobs burning down the cities. And so in order to counteract that optically, I think it would make sense to have Trump supporters physically present in DC, not to engage in any kind of violence, but simply to counteract the false impression that it's the people, quote unquote, who are against Trump, and it's just Trump and his kind of federal agents who are clamping down on them. Although if these so-called peaceful protesters decide to get too peaceful and start burning down things and attacking people, then of course the president is entirely justified and in fact obligated to do everything he has to do to clamp down on it. But just from an optical standpoint, I think it is better to have Trump's constituencies there physically present, have like all of the biker groups, the Biker for Trump, the truckers, like there are a lot of people, there are a lot of constituencies, even, the Tea Party groups, the MAGA groups, there's a lot of different groups, and they should all be physically present. What the left is doing, they have like the Move On, Color of Change, all these different groups that organize people. They're trying to get, SMS contacts for 4 million people that they can just text message and mobilize them immediately and get them to swarm DC. Now, you can't, again, this speaks to what I was saying earlier, is like we're totally outmaneuvered in terms of organizational capacity. You can't really build that capacity overnight. They build that capacity so they can do 4 million texts and get people to swarm the nation's capital, whereas the idiot Republican types get, if they had 4 million texts, they would probably use it, just to sell something stupid.
Trumpy bears.
They have total like dumb mindset, and that's what it means. They're not playing for keeps. So They need to start thinking like adults, need to start thinking like serious people. But again, that's a longer term endeavor. For now, I do think that, to the extent that it's possible to do responsibly, that the president should encourage a physical presence in the Capitol in order to countervail the false impression that there's just this mass popular swelling against him, which there's not. In fact, it's quite the opposite. The people, by and large, are absolutely fed up with these Antifa, riots of people burning down cities, shouting down ordinary citizens. People hate it.
Yeah.
People just are so turned off by it. And it would be a shame to have the impression that, the general American public supports it when in fact it's quite the opposite.
I completely agree with you. This hour has just whizzed by. Darren J. Beattie, I want to encourage everyone to follow you if they already aren't on Twitter at Darren J. Beattie. And of course, you should be reading every single day, if not every single hour, Revolver News. We've learned so much. Recognize patterns, name names, play the long game. Optics matter. And we're going to have to do this again because we didn't even get into the Supreme Court battle. Right. So I know you're in high demand now, so I'll have to get with your booker.
Yeah, talk to my agent, Michelle.
Sounds great. Loved it. Talk to you soon again. Thanks so much, Darren J. Take care.
Thank you.